Okay, Mark, over to you.
Right, thank you very much. And as you can see, we're going to look at one book, The Ultra Secret, one man, Frederick Winterbottom, because he was the man who effectively wrote the first book that opened the door on the Bletchley Park Enigma secret. There he is, just at the start of World War II. Handsome looking chap in his RAF uniform, aged, as you see, aged 42. And that's him, and that's the book. Many of you will recognize it, even though you may not have seen it in that particular form. That is the dust jacket that came out on the first editions and issues of the book. And this is what we're concentrating on. I'm concentrating on this evening. He was born in 1897, so he's a Victorian, really. Born in 1897, and his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather were all successful solicitors in Stroud, Gloucestershire. Stroud is really quite an attractive little town, very much typical English country town. You see at the top left there an aerial view, rolling countryside, trees, small fields and so on, and a little town nestling in the middle. Down the bottom right, you see a view of one of the streets in Stroud, a great mixture of buildings. It's not the one from 1897, I assure you, but you can see the sort of mixture of buildings and a statue there that you get in the little country towns in England. Interestingly, only in March, according to this Times article, Stroud was named the best place to live in the whole of the United Kingdom. And certainly, if you had been, as Winterbottom's father was, a successful professional man in a small town like that, you would have had a very comfortable life. A big house, you had servants, you had horses and so on. And this is what Frederick Winterbottom might have inherited. Interestingly, and I didn't realize this until fairly recently, the name Winterbottom still lives on, is as an active solicitors firm in the area. So that is, although I contacted them fairly recently, the chap I spoke to had absolutely no clue about the importance of this sprig of the Winterbottom family, Frederick Winterbottom, the subject of today's talk. Now, Frederick Winterbottom was sent off to boarding school, but he grew very rapidly. He grew in his early teens, he grew to 6 foot. And the conventional wisdom in those days was that he'd somehow outgrown his strength. And the medical advice was that he should go on a round the world trip. And so age 16, he was sent off by himself, no friends or guardians or relatives, sent off on an extensive trip, as you can see, around the world, and it lasted for pretty well 9 months. He went obviously by sea from UK across to Canada. He crossed Canada by rail, boarded another boat there, went off to Japan, and then down south, calling on various ports on the way down to Australia, spent time in Australia and New Zealand, and came back via Ceylon. A pretty amazing trip for a young man who was only 16 at the time. He got back in 1914, well before the start of World War I. He finished school, he worked hard there, and he was offered a place at Cambridge University. But of course, the war intervened, and all young men with any spirit wanted to join the war. And I'm sure you've heard the sort of rather ironic stories of people who felt that they were hoping to join the war very quickly because it might be over before they got a chance to sign up and see some fighting. And of course, how disappointed they were going to be. But nevertheless, he joined the Royal Gloucestershire Hussars, and you can see the cap badge down there, bottom left-hand corner, as a cavalry officer. He'd had great experience with horses. He was in a kind of horsey part of the country, no trouble, and he was working as employed as a cavalry officer there, training both men and horses for cavalry service during World War I. A bit antiquated, you might think, and indeed it was. The powers that be decided in 1916 that they would take away the horses from this cavalry group and replace them with bicycles. And whereas Freddie was quite happy to have been a cavalry officer, he did not want to ride a bicycle into war. And he then got permission to join the Royal Flying Corps. And you can see their badge there, top right-hand corner. Joined the Royal Flying Corps. They were in 1916. The Royal Air Force, of course, didn't exist at that stage because it wasn't formed until 1918 by a merger of the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps. So the sort of Army flyers and the naval flyers got together and formed a third service, which was the Royal Air Force. There he is. He was employed in France. He was working in France with the Royal Flying Corps, and his job as effectively a fighter pilot was to protect the British camera planes which were flying over enemy lines in order to try to see what was going on, what trench work was going on, where the big guns were situated, ammunition dumps and all that kind of thing. So these were intelligence gathering planes, camera planes, flying at a fairly low level over enemy territory and protected by people like Winterbottom in modest fighter planes. Not surprisingly, there was a big attrition rate. Not surprisingly, he was shot down, and of course he was shot down on the German side of the line. That's because that's where the camera planes were, and he was taken prisoner, as you see, in July 1917. The fellow officers who'd seen his plane come down saw a fairly disastrous crash, and it was assumed he wouldn't have survived, and so he was effectively reported as having had his life lost in active service in 1917. But of course, that turned out not to be the case. He was taken prisoner, and he served as an American. He saw time as a prisoner of war for something like 18 months, during which time he made a particular attempt to talk to the German guards that he was involved with, or were involved with him, learn something about German, learn something about Germany, learn something about the German military and the organization of it. And as a prisoner of war, he was moved several times. And so he saw quite a lot of Germany, albeit through the bars. He got quite a working knowledge of Germany and the German military during his time as a prisoner of war. When he came back, it transpired that he was going to be one of those very select and unusual group of people, a person who had seen and read their own obituary, because not nationally, but certainly in the local papers down in Gloucestershire, when he was reported as having been missing in action, obituaries appeared in the local papers, and he was one of the few people then who read his own obituary when he came back. So he came back and he took up the education again. He saw an advert for university courses, crash university courses in Oxford. Now, he saw that the Oxford University was offering crash courses for people who'd had their education interrupted by the war, as he, of course, had. So although he'd had one place at Cambridge before the war, he saw this advert for Oxford, and he went to Oxford and did an accelerated law degree because it was assumed by the family that he would join this successful, long-standing firm of solicitors in Stroud. He didn't really fancy that. He did do some work for them, but in 21, as you see, he married Erica Horniman. You might recognize the name Horniman because they were at one time one of the world's largest dealers in tea, Horniman's Tea, and much money had been accrued by the family. And when he married Erica, she actually came to the wedding, as it were. She came to the marriage bringing quite a substantial amount of money. And they decided, he and Erica decided, not to let him go back into the law firm, which he didn't really want to do, but to set up farming. So they bought farm and they started farming in Gloucestershire. However, the 1920s were a very poor time for British farmers, partly because of the cheapening transport and cheapening food from places like North America, from Canada, from Australia and New Zealand. Food could be imported cheaply on a very large scale, and it made it very difficult for farmers in England to compete. And so, although he was making a living, he didn't really think that it was going to provide him with the sort of life that he wanted. And he undertook a very long trip throughout Africa from north to south, because there was, at that time, there was quite a lot of emigres from England or from Britain going out and buying chunks of farmland in Central Africa, in the more amenable parts of Central Africa, places like the Kenya uplands and so on, where there was land which was cheap, there was land that was fertile, the conditions, the meteorological conditions weren't extreme, and there were some people living a very nice life there. And he decided he would go and investigate the possibilities of that. So he went by sea through the Mediterranean to Port Said, the northern end of the Suez Canal, and then on a very adventurous trip, by river steamer, by coastal steamer, by train, by lorry, all sorts of forms of transport. He went down from the very northeast of Africa right down to South Africa to Durban. But he decided on balance that it wasn't a good place to be setting up a farm at that particular stage. So he comes back to UK in 1928, but he still hasn't found a career which is going to give him the kind of lifestyle that he aspired to. He was recommended to, and then was recruited by, as you see there, recruited by SIS, MI6, to set up an intelligence organization gathering information specifically for the RAF. There were similar organizations already within MI6 gathering information relating to army and naval subjects, but there wasn't one specifically for the RAF, and he was taken on for that purpose. He was apparently the first graduate to be recruited into SIS, which I've seen that said. It seems to me very surprising. But although some people weren't sure whether he was suited for it, he had quite an experience of the world, because remember, he'd had at the age 16, he'd had this trip around the world. When he was in 1928, he'd had this trip right through Africa. So he had quite a big experience of the world, and he'd been involved not only with aviation in World War I, he'd also recognized the extraordinary importance of gathering intelligence, and particular photographic intelligence, the importance of that for war. So he might not have been an absolute fit for the job he was given, but he had some good qualifications for it. As you can see, he gets named in the Gestapo handbook for the invasion of Britain subsequently. But while he was working for SIS, in that run-up to the beginning of the World War II, and that was from 1930 to 39, he actively visited Germany specifically in order to discover what they were doing. I mean, he was a very personal kind of chap. He was a good mixer, and he was very convincing, and he met a very large number of high-ranking people, including Hitler and Hess and many officers of the Luftwaffe. And he did tell them a little bit about what was going on in the RAF, the comparatively newly formed RAF. Some people have even suggested he was a double agent, providing information about Britain to Germany and providing information about Germany to Britain. But that is not true. It was absolutely clear that anything that he was doing, any minor bits of information he might have given to his contacts in Germany, he was doing this in order to entice them to provide him with very much more valuable information about German intentions and German readiness for war in the 1930s. And the information he was bringing back, it came into his department, but he was the person who was providing Churchill with a great deal of information about German intentions. Of course, at that time, Churchill was a bit of a lone voice in the Commons, because he was very much in favor of rearmament. He wasn't prime minister by that means, of course, at that time, of course, but much of the information that Churchill was using in the Commons in the 30s was coming via Winterbottom. He gets mentioned, as you see, in the Gestapo handbook edited by Schellenberg for the invasion of Britain. It actually says the head of the Secret Intelligence Service Air Section is Wing Commander Winterbottom. And it's interesting that it's spelt out like that, because obviously they've got that not from a printed document. They obviously got it from somebody telling them. And I think, of course, the people who were telling the Germans at this stage, the people who gave a lot of information to Germany, were Best and Stevens, who'd been captured at Venlo at the end of 1939. And they not surprisingly, provided quite a lot of intelligence information to Germany. So I think that's where that bit of information shall come from. But there we are. We've got the handbook for the invasion of Britain. And not only does it identify Winterbottom, but it actually says where his office was located. During the run-up to the war, he teamed up with a very intrepid and a very talented and inventive and imaginative flyer called Sidney Cotton. Sidney Cotton, incidentally, gave his name to that flying suit you see there, the Sidcot flying suit, which was used by the RAF to provide warmth and insulation for pilots and airmen right up to the 1950s. But Sidney Cotton and Winterbottom, between them, they solved the problem which had been dogging aerial photography for a long time. And that was that when you get more than a few thousand feet in the air, the camera lenses, which you've got poking out of the bottom of your aircraft, they get condensation, and therefore you don't get a clear view. And between them, Cotton and Winterbottom devised a technique for providing a way of avoiding this condensation happening. And the result of that was that they could fly well above the range of anti-aircraft fire. They could fly up to, say, 20,000 feet. And in the late 1930s, they ran a lot of photo trips over not only Germany, but also over Italy, photographing in particular naval installations and so on, and bringing back some very valuable reconnaissance information back to UK. Sidney Cotton was a good talker, and he pretended all these trips that he was making to Germany, he pretended this was because he was prospecting for running a commercial airline in the post-war, well, not post-war period, but in the coming years, and he got away with it. And he and Winterbottom provided a great deal of aerial photography information for UK. On to the wartime. Of course, he has an involvement at Bletchley Park, but of course, he is not a codebreaker. He's not a mathematician. He's not a technical man in that sense, or he's not a scientific man in that sense. His greatest contribution is not in cryptography or cryptanalysis or even interception. His greatest contribution was the establishment of the special liaison units. And this he set up in 1940. The Bletchley was of course producing excellent information by breaking many of the Enigma enciphered messages. But it's no good doing all that breaking of the messages unless you can get it securely and speedily to people in the field who can take advantage of it. That's the real test of whether Bletchley Park has been worthwhile. Did it help us to win battles out in the field during the war? The answer to that, of course, is yes. And one of the reasons it's yes is because Winterbottom devised a technique whereby this information could be got to people like Montgomery in North Africa in a totally secure manner. It's got to be speedy because the sort of information that they were dealing with at that time was very much tactical stuff. And if it was more than a few days old, then it would have been overtaken by events. So it's got to be got there quickly. Therefore, it's got to go by radio, by wireless. And you can bet your life that the Germans will be listening in to every single message that was being sent over to British forces in North Africa. And if they could, by breaking any of those British messages, if they could deduce that the only reason this high quality information was going to or could be got to Montgomery, it was that we were breaking the Enigma encrypted messages. So there was a tremendous need to provide complete security for these messages. And so Winterbottom created the special liaison units, which were typically would be for young RAF officers, pretty junior officers, but competent chaps, and they would be attached to, let's say, Montgomery's command. They wouldn't be in his caravan, as it were. They'd have a separate installation, separate establishment, and the messages originating from Bletchley would come directly to them, having been encrypted by a one-time pad system. And of course, if you use a one-time pad system correctly and it doesn't get in any way kidnapped, the documentation doesn't get kidnapped by the enemy, then it provides total security because the ciphered messages will be completely unbreakable. So the messages would go to the special liaison unit, say 200 or 300 meters away from Montgomery. They would decrypt an incoming message and then would walk over to Montgomery's caravan and knock on the door and say, General, I think we've got something here. You ought to to know about as soon as possible, some valuable information about Rommel's intentions. And if Montgomery were to say, I'm busy, young man, just stick it on the table, I'll look at it later, they would have to say, and this is quite difficult for them because they're many ranks lower than Montgomery, they'd have to say, I'm terribly sorry, General, I cannot leave this behind with you. I can read it to you, I can read it to you more than once, but I am not permitted to leave the piece of paper behind. Great care was taken by the special liaison units not to allow any of the paperwork to be captured, and the basic rule was that nothing could be left with anybody else except members of the SLU, and after a week everything would have to be burnt anyway. So by applying these rigorous sorts of rules to the operation of the SLUs, Winterbottom's greatest contribution in World War II was the successful dissemination and delivery of this high quality information to officers in the field, helping them in the battles and so on that they were facing at the time. Now, he was involved. He knew basically what was going on at Bletchley. Obviously, he knew where a lot of this information was coming from, and he was instrumental in getting it to people who needed it. When the war was ending in 1945, this is quotation from Winterbottom, he urges continuing secrecy. His instructions to the special liaison units and senior officers ended. It's realized that sometimes it'll be hard for those who worked on Ultra to avoid hinting at what they did in the war, but avoid it they must. Still more, must any temptation to write or lecture on the contribution of Ultra be resisted. Now that's ironic, because there he is putting a pretty firm line down to stop people speaking about or talking about and writing about Ultra in the immediate post-war period. And then ironically, of course, it was Winterbottom himself who was the very first person to do exactly that, to write, or not to lecture necessarily, but to write on the contribution of Ultra. But there he is telling other people they shouldn't do it. Now, not surprisingly, the secret was slipping out. Winterbottom's book was published in 1974, and this table of authors and dates just goes to 73, because I just want to show you that various authors who were writing about various topics during various World War topics of World War II, they did have some indication, or sometimes give some indication, of what was going on. Now, this is not a complete list, and it's only to give you a flavor of things, but there you have Gallery. He is a US naval officer in 1957, talking about the capture from a U-boat of a cipher machine, and that being able to break the ciphers would be of use with broad intelligence use. And you can see various writers, this is not a complete list by any means, but various writers have they don't make a great deal of it, but they have passing reference to Enigma, of capturing Enigma machines from U-boats. Bletchley Park is mentioned by some of them. The idea that there would be broad intelligence use is mentioned by most of them. Even some people like Denniston and Knox are mentioned in some books. They're actually identified by name, and some reference is occasionally given to the hugely important work of the Poles in the pre-war period. So all these books had little snippets of information, but none of them made much of it. They might only be a line or two, but the secret was slowly leaking out, as you can see, including, you'll see halfway down the table, a book by Winterbottom himself, because his first published book, which came out before the one we're looking at today, before the Ultra Secret, was a book called Secret and Personal. And even he, in that, did make some reference to the Enigma story. But what really accelerated the production of his own book was that in 1972, Winterbottom was visited by a journalist. This is Cave Brown, in fact. Winterbottom is farming then. He's down in the West Country, and somebody knocks on the door one day and says, I'm doing some research on the Second World War, and I understand you know a lot about code breaking, etc., etc. Can you tell me something about it? And Winterbottom was very unwilling to share any information with him. I don't know whether he had already decided to write a book about Ultra, or whether the appearance of Cave Brown made him thought that would be a good book could be written. But if he had been thinking about it, then certainly Cave Brown's appearance would have given Winterbottom a bit of a boost to say, right, I better get on with it if I'm going to get my book out before Cave Brown does anything. So he may have learnt, he may have thought of this opportunity because of Cave Brown's visit, or he may have already had it at the back of his mind to do something. Now, his book, this one, which you'll see once or twice during the course of this presentation, it's not the first. I must stress, it is not the first full-length book about Enigma. There was a Polish book, as you can see, in 67. There was a French book in 73, and then there's Winterbottom's book in 74. That's interestingly, that reflects the order in which the intelligence departments of these various countries got to grips with Enigma, because it was the Poles first, and they of course teamed up with Bertrand of the French intelligence service, and it's not until after that that Britain gets seriously involved. So that's just by the way, they happen to come out in that order. But although Winterbottom's was not the first book, full-length book about Ultra, these other two, particularly the Polish one and the French one, these other two did not receive the widespread acclaim that you think they might have done. The Polish one, because too few people in the world read Polish or bother with Polish. The French one was a rather bizarre book, although Bertrand himself had been personally involved in helping the getting information to the Poles in the early 1930s. So it's not the first book, but Winterbottom's book is the first book that receives worldwide acclaim and makes a difference to the way in which people perceive the war. To achieve publications, he had to face a lot of obstacles. The typescript that he was preparing had to be submitted, amongst others, to the D-Notice Committee, to MI6, to GCHQ, to the Foreign Office, and indeed to the newly elected Prime Minister, Harold Wilson. And this has led to some confusion, because some people have thought, if all these people like MI6 and GCHQ and the Prime Minister saw the book, surely it carries some kind of official stamp of approval. Well, it doesn't really. The point is that these bodies were looking at it not to see whether what Winterbottom said was right, but to make sure Winterbottom didn't say anything was going to embarrass the D-Notice Committee or MI6 or GCHQ or the Foreign Office or anyone else. They were only there to cross out the bits they didn't like, not to put any official stamp of approval on what Winterbottom was saying. And that's a point which is well worth making, because although it has this official approval, it's not an approval of the content of the book. It doesn't demonstrate that anything he said was correct or was endorsed by the government. And indeed, he was not allowed access to the 500,000 or more documents which are now in the National Archive. It was known they existed. These 500,000 documents are arising from the work at Bletchley. It was well known they existed, but they were under lock and key at GCHQ. And Winterbottom was not allowed to have a look at any of those. Clearly it's not going to be a totally correct, officially sanctioned book. It published in 1974, almost simultaneously in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Now, I do not know the exact dates, and if anyone does have an exact date of publication of this book, either in UK or USA, I would be very pleased to hear from them. My best estimate is that it was published in UK on the 24th of October 74, and the USA first edition hardback was the 1st of November 74. So really only a week later. They're virtually simultaneous. The UK paperback comes out about a year later, and that's what's depicted there. Now, one or two people have said, well, you can easily find out publication date, because have a look on Amazon, because every book they list has got a publication date. But let this be a warning to you. Do not trust what Amazon say bibliographically, because they've got an algorithm that demands a day of the month and a month of publication, even if you don't know it. So if you just put in a year of publication, or if they just add to their list a year of publication, it automatically assigns the date 1st of January. And they've got hundreds of thousands of books which supposedly published on the 1st of January. And the 1st of January is probably the worst day of the year to publish a book. And I don't believe anyone ever publishes books on the 1st of January. More than that, you can see that they don't even get the year right necessarily, because this book, which actually came out in 1975, has a publication date listed of the 1st of January 1807. I cannot explain why this should be so, but it's a clear demonstration that you can't rely on Amazon for bibliographic information. The book came out late 1974 and produced great interest on both sides of the Atlantic. The reviewers were absolutely hooked by the revelation, but they were wary. At one end of the scale, some of them said, this is so important that the whole history of the war must be rewritten. The others said, rather more guardedly, the subject cries out for more ample treatment, which is a very polite way of saying we're not quite sure this is totally right. They were both, in a sense, they were both correct, because any history of the war you would write now, or indeed post 74, would be incomplete without acknowledging that some of the decisions were influenced by intelligence being produced at Bletchley. On the other hand, Winterbottom's account, requiring more ample treatment, as I said, Winterbottom's account was unsubstantiated and was based on the memories of 30 or 40 years ago. And it would be surprising if it were totally accurate. And indeed, it is not totally accurate. That's the first American edition. Came out just about the same time. And if you had a copy of that book that I've just shown, and you looked inside at the back of the title page and you saw that, you would assume, with every justification, that you've got a first edition of the book, because there it is, ultra secret, copyright 74. It's got a Library of Congress catalogue card number 74-7826. So it looks as though it's a first edition, but it is not a first edition, because that's what it should look like. It should have the line, you can see near the bottom, first US edition. And the fact that the one at the top does not say first US edition means that it is not the first edition. It's a later reprint. And the trouble with this is that you don't know whether or not the publisher has made some changes between issuing the first edition, which is shown at the bottom, and issuing a later printing, which is shown further up the page there. He may or may not have done. You don't know. And that's a great problem. When you get to looking at these tiny details of the dates and issue of various books, this is something which is more frequently gone into in great detail by people who collect what are called modern first editions, generally fiction and poetry. Modern first edition collectors are very keen to get the very earliest possible issue of the book they're interested in. But they can sometimes divide a first edition into a first impression, second impression, third impression. Now, those impressions should all be identical, but they're not. That's the trouble. The first impression will be the batch of books that the publisher first orders. He might tentatively order 2,000 copies of the first edition. If they sell very quickly, he'll then ring up the printer and say, run us off another 5,000 copies. And there should be no changes to the text. If that's the case, that becomes a second impression. And when that sells out or is nearly sold out, he phones up the printer and says, run us off another batch, and that'll be the third impression. They should be textually identical, but alas, that is not always the case. And even impressions themselves may sometimes be subdivided into different issues. For instance, it's quite possible, and I can cite you several examples of this, where when a book isn't selling terribly well, the publisher will scrap not the books, but all the dust jackets. All the dust jackets will be binned, and brand new dust jackets will be printed, and the existing stock of books will be wrapped in a totally different dust jacket, which will give a better sales potential to the book. That happens not infrequently. And that, of course, the text is the same, but that would give you a first impression, a first issue of an impression and a second issue, because obviously the one with the new dust jacket is not the same issue as the one which had the original jacket on. So it is worth thinking about whether things are the very first edition or not. And you'll see in a moment some of the difficulties that can arise when there is confusion between editions. Incidentally, Max Hastings was asked to review Winterbottom's book when it came out, and he admitted years later, he admitted that he'd had a phone call from a newspaper editor who'd said, "Would you like to review a book?" And Max said, I'm very busy. I'm very busy at the moment. You know, what's it about? Well, it's about the war, and you do a lot of stuff on the war. And it shows, an extraordinary book. It shows that the British had been breaking German codes for most of the war, and it provided a huge amount of intelligence which influenced the way in which the Allies acted. And Max Hastings, not surprisingly, said, and I quote from him, "It sounded like a lot of sensationalist nonsense." So he politely told the editor that the book obviously wasn't worth reviewing, and he didn't review it. And then he says, again, Max Hastings confesses, a few weeks later, "I could only hang my head." So the book came out, and the public were captivated, but the intelligence community were not captivated. For example, David Hunt, who had been an intelligence officer during the Second World War, found fault with much of the content of the book. And he said, he summarized that in the Times Literary Supplement in December 74. He said, "Winterbottom has let out a big secret, but has failed to write a good book." John Tiltman, possibly the finest British cryptographer of all time, was less concerned by the errors in Winterbottom's book than he was concerned by the effect of publication. He realized that this was opening the door. Another review written by some other person who worked at Bletchley Park, Calvo Caresi, Tiltman wrote in 1975, he wrote, "I'm quite unable to understand Calvo Caresi's arrogant assumption that he can say what he likes in public now that Winterbottom's book has appeared. I hold the view that everyone who worked in Bletchley is still under a moral obligation not to disclose secrets without official permission." So Tiltman feared that the ultra secret had uncorked the intelligence genie from the official secrets bottle, and that would be an irreversible process. And he was right, of course. So what of the book? It is exciting. It's got a lot of new material, and it does help to explain some developments in the Second World War. But if you pick it up, even if you know nothing about cryptography or wartime history or anything else, if you pick it up, you can see, without reading it, you can see that it is not an academic book. The style is not academic. There are no references at all. There's no sources at all. There's no bibliography. It's written 30 years after the events that it describes. And by that time, Winterbottom was 77, without any access to contemporary documents and without a diary to refer to. So it would hardly likely to be accurate. So even if you know nothing about the story, you would not open this book and say this must be an accurate book. And also, we have to remember that when people write their autobiographies, I think we would all be tempted just to polish things a little, to leave out some of the things that we thought didn't show us to best advantage, to puff up the things that we did well, and we want to give as much exposure to those as possible, and to perhaps claim to be rather more important than we actually were. And of course, if you're not tied down to limiting yourself to any other printed documents or manuscript documents or references of any sort, of course, it's very tempting to do that. So for various reasons, one would not expect a book like The Ultra Secret to be totally accurate. And it does have some major errors, and this is not a complete list by any means. It mangles the contribution of the Poles, I mean, almost to absurdity. I mean, it really, really, really underestimates and misunderstands what the Poles had achieved. There's reference in the book to a bronze goddess. This is a description of a machine with a big round brown bronze face, which produces decrypts. Well, nobody who worked at Bletchley Park has ever seen anything which matches Winterbottom's description. It contains a story of the sacrifice of Coventry, which is unfortunately is completely wrong, but has lived on. Many people remember the idea that Coventry was sacrificed to protect the Enigma secret. And Winterbottom certainly misunderstands the influence the intelligence had on the exact timing of D-Day. And although it is about Bletchley Park, There is no reference to any other cryptography going on, no other systems like the Geheimschreiber or anything like that. It refers only to Enigma. So there's nothing there about Colossus. There is no reference to the bomb. I mean, that's not a bronze goddess in anyone's book. Effectively, no attribution to the Poles, and nothing about Alan Turing. Now, the mangled account of the Polish work was very quickly brought to Winterbottom's attention, and subsequently, this extra note, this extra paragraph was added to the book. It's put at the end of an early chapter, so it was easy enough to add it to the text, as it were, because nothing had to be cut out, nothing had to be squeezed up. There was plenty of room on a half-blank page towards the end, or sorry, at the end of a chapter, to add this note. And he says, first of all, that the Polish mathematicians and technicians displayed brilliance and great courage, and that's undisputable. And he also says, but the story I have given is the one told to me at the time. And that reflects perhaps the fact that he's writing honestly. What he wrote down in the book when it first appeared was what he believed to be the case, because no one had told him anything else. He did not need to know, for setting up special liaison units and so on, he did not need to know where the ability to break Enigma had first come from, what the Polish contribution was. So why would anyone tell him? There was a lot of compartmentalization at Bletchley, and the need to know principle seems to have been very well applied. So this paragraph was added early on. Now, this is a table of some of the editions of this book. And you'll see up top left-hand corner, we're starting off with UK first edition, first impression, which I think was published on the 24th of October, 1974. And obviously it didn't have that note, that extra, that hugely valuable, hugely important paragraph about the Poles. The second edition came out very quickly, same month. It did not have the paragraph about the Poles. The third edition comes out in December, not long afterwards, and again, nothing about the Poles. But extraordinarily, every single American edition, right from the USA first edition, first impression, the very first way it appeared, it has the Polish extra paragraph in. And I cannot explain how this actually came about and why the Americans got that into their issues before the British did, because they are using, the American printings are made from a British master. British spelling conventions, British typography conventions, and so on are followed. So they're using a master which has been generated in Britain, and yet they managed to incorporate the correction, this very important correction, right from the very word go, whereas it took some time for it to filter through into the issues that were being put on the market and sold in Britain. So the book club edition, the Purnell book club edition in the UK, probably came out in 74 or 75, doesn't have the note. When we get to that paperback, 1975, that's about a year after the book first appeared, it does have the note about the Poles. And the fourth edition of the hardback, British hardback, has that edition. But you can see the pink stripes there, the two early issues in America, both the hardback and the paperback. Every single one of those has got this very important paragraph about the Poles. Quite how what the mechanics of that are, I do not understand, but that is a fact. And I'll return to the bottom two at in the yellow band at the bottom in a moment. But these were two later printings in 1999 and 2000. Now, thinking about impressions and editions, and does it make a difference to know whether you're dealing with a first impression or a second impression? Well, here is proof that it does, because if you have the right kind of eye for these things, if you look at this page, in this particular extract from the Ultra Secret, you can see about halfway down this extract I've got, the type looks a little bit faint. It's fainter than it is at the top or the bottom. And that is because it's had a change made. The master has been changed to incorporate a change. To a textual change, and no indication is given anywhere else in the book that that change has been made. there, stepping back a bit, there's a book, a copy with the change made. You can see that palish band across the middle at the top there. And then further down, you can see there's no pale band. And if we enlarge those two, what do we see? We see that the sentence started off in the original edition, Alexander Babbage Milner, Barry, names to whisper in the world of chess. And it's changed to Alexander, Babbage, Milner Barry, correctly, because it's only one person. It's not two persons. And the name of Gordon Welshman has been added. He's not a chess player, but that's not the point. So you've got two books, both of which look as though they should be identical. And one of them mentions Gordon Welshman and one doesn't. And the one that mentions Gordon Welshman doesn't mention him in the index. There's no clue to the reader that his book, his copy has got Gordon Welshman in, but other copies don't have. And you can see what difficulties this can create, because you might, you and your friend might be discussing something on the telephone and talking about the book, and somebody says, well, the worst thing about this book is that it doesn't mention Gordon Welshman. And your friend says, yes, it does. I can remember it somewhere near the beginning. I'll go and get mine. And they thumb through and they have an argument about whether it does or it doesn't. Well, you can see one of the books does mention Gordon Welshman and the other one doesn't. And unless you have detected this pale band, this lighter printing in the middle of the page, you won't have noticed that there's a change has been made, and other changes are made. And these changes are made by publishers between impressions. So although they don't tell you, they have actually made textual changes between successive issues of the book. And that is why it's hugely important, if you're going to quote to or refer to these books, it's at the very least you should mention which printing you're quoting from or which edition you're quoting from. But ideally, you want to be able to quote or react to the very earliest issue of the book, because that is the way that the world first saw it. The very first issue of the book, these are the books, the copies of the books that were sent for review to library buyers, to important people who might review them or give them some kind of publicity. That's the way the world first saw the book, not in this corrected form. And it's very important to try and establish, when you're referring to books, that you are referring to the earliest possible edition, because that's the way that it made its impact on the world when it first came out. So these things do actually matter, although it seems like nitpicking to talk about whether they're first impressions or second impressions. There are changes made which the publisher does not flag up at all. And you can see it could give to problems about argument about whether a book did or didn't say things. Looking at some of the other another mention of something that was badly dealt with in the book, Coventry was bombed, as we know. Winterbottom claims that Churchill knew that Coventry was going to be attacked in a planned German bombing raid, and that Churchill decided not to defend it because had we defended it out of the blue, as it were, the Germans might have concluded that we could only have done that, only made that tactical decision because we knew a bombing raid was coming. So Winterbottom says that Churchill sacrificed Coventry in order to protect the Enigma secret. It's totally untrue, but unfortunately it's had a lot of mileage. Many people after lectures where I've been talking about Enigma and so on, they came along and they said, oh, you never mentioned Coventry, the fact that Coventry was sacrificed to protect Enigma. Well, the answer, I haven't mentioned it. The reason why I haven't mentioned it, it's not true. And although I don't wish in any way to belittle the sacrifice of Coventry, the damage in Coventry, the deaths in Coventry, it wasn't a deliberate bombing raid in order to kill civilians. It was a bombing raid to attack the great mass of aviation and motor and engine making factories there were in and around Coventry. Took place, as you see there, on the 14th of November 1940, and 568 people were killed, and we must acknowledge that. And as I say, I'm not belittling the sacrifice or the hurt to the people who were killed and their family, friends and families, but we have to put it into some kind of context. Very few people would tell you where the biggest bombing raid in the United Kingdom during the war was. And look at it, it's Belfast. There was bigger loss of life in Belfast, big shipbuilding centre, of course, bigger loss of life in Belfast than any other single bombing raid in the UK. Yet very, very, very few people ever heard of it. but all sorts of people have heard about the Coventry one. And you can see also that the Blitz, you know, from running from September 40 to May 41, over 40,000 civilian deaths were lost. So 560 people died, and that is a disaster, clearly. And I'm not trying to take anything away from the disaster that was. But if we put it in the context of the Second World War, it was not the sacrifice of a city. And of course, the figures that we can see there are as nothing compared with the deaths created by the Allied bombing raids on German cities later on in the war. But let's look for a moment at the American paperback. It's got a similar but slightly more colorful jacket or cover than the hardback. And turn it over. Ultra, the secret that was worth sacrificing an entire city for. In 1940, the German Air Force bombed Coventry, demolishing the city and causing atrocious civilian casualties. Well, this is a gross exaggeration, and it's down to Winterbottom. This is a great mistake in Winterbottom's analysis and Winterbottom's book. A great mistake to try and argue that, firstly, that the city was demolished, which it wasn't, and secondly, that it was done in order to protect the Enigma secret. This is absolutely wrong. So sometimes these books that receive wide publicity carry forward something that is totally wrong. And once it's in the public domain, it's very difficult to overcome that. The book was a great success in publishing terms. There were, as we've seen, there were reprints in the UK and the USA in both hardback and paperback. It was issued also, at least in countries like Canada, in France. There's a French one. I'm rather peeved that it says on the title page, it says traduit de l'américain, translated from the American, because although they may have translated it from an American edition, actually the type setting was done and the spelling and so on was done in Britain rather than America. However, that's what it says. It was published in Germany. Sometimes these other foreign editions have a different name. They're not all called Top Secret Ultra, as you can see. It was published in Italy. There's a couple of Italian versions. It was published strikingly in Slovenia. That is extraordinary because the population of Slovenia was well under 2 million at the time, and very, very few people outside Slovenia speak Slovenian. A few in Austria, possibly a few in northeastern Italy, a few in Croatia, but it's not a widely spoken language. But they thought it was an important enough book to have a separate Slovenian edition. It was also published in Spain and Sweden. Now, that's not a complete list. Winterbottom said that it was published or republished in every major language in the world except Chinese. Whether it was or not, I don't know. But certainly there were foreign editions all over the world, as you can see. There was also at one time a film was planned. And I've got a recording of an interview with Winterbottom where he's talking about the film and what a wonderful thing it's going to be. He names the actors are going to be in it, but it was never produced. And I think perhaps that's just as well. But the book, as I say, was a great success. And by 1987, 13 years after it had come out, the sales had reached 4 million copies. I have tried from both the to get from the publishing conglomerate that owns Weidenfeld Nicholson, and I've tried also from the vestigial or the rump of Weidenfeld Nicholson to discover firstly what the present sales are, and also to try and discover those initial publication dates, but I haven't had a reply from either of them, unfortunately. Now, I just gave a mention. You remember I had a table with a yellow band across the bottom, and I said we'll come back to this in a moment. These are publications, issues that came out in 1999 and 2000, paperback in 2000, hardback in 1999. This was part of Weidenfeld Nicholson's celebration of their own, I think it was their own 50th anniversary, a sort of special edition. They produced a new printing of this book, but they used the original master. So it has all the flaws and errors, including no mention of the Polish contribution, no, not that extra paragraph in at all. And there were no corrections, although this is 25 years after the book came out, and much, much more was known, much more had been published and explored and released in archives and so on. And they made no attempt, the publishers made no attempt to set this book in the proper context that it should be set in. They just reprinted it as it stood in 1974. That's in strong contrast to the very responsible stance taken by Greenhill, who republished in the year 2000 a very important book, Patrick Beasley's Very Special Intelligence. Now, that had come out in 1977. It's roughly the same time as Winterbottom, but because so much more had been learnt between 77 and 2000, they printed the whole of the original text so you could see what it was like. That's sensible. There's nothing wrong with that. And then they got two important people, two knowledgeable people, Gardner and Ralph Erskine, to write chunks to go in at the beginning and at the end to explain what was right about Beasley, what was wrong about Beasley, what we had learnt about the work of the Admiralty's and Operational Intelligence Centre, how much more update we got. So they give the new reader who comes to that book in the year 2000, they give them a proper context to view what Beasley had written and was published originally in 77. And Weidenfeld Nicholson made no attempt to do that at all. And I think that's irresponsible publishing. And the most extraordinary thing is, which they obviously didn't realize, they give the Poles no credit at all for having done what they did. And yet, by some quirk, they have used on the front cover, not an original Enigma machine, but a photograph of a Polish replica. If you had the dust jacket before you, you could see that row of keys along the left-hand side is actually alphabetical, which is what the keys on the Polish replicas were. You can see the rows of bulbs there, they're spherical, and you mustn't use spherical bulbs in an Enigma machine because it damages the perspex screen over the top. And where the batteries should be, at the right-hand side, we've got the two spare rotors, because we're talking about a three-rotor machine here with two extra rotors. And in the Polish version, they stored them there rather than have the battery there, which would have been in a genuine Enigma machine. So not only have the publishers not put this in the right context, not only have they overlooked the injustice done to the Poles by the original decision, the original publication, they haven't even bothered to use a proper picture. They've used a picture made by people whom they would have denied had done anything on the Enigma code breaking. Very bad indeed. Very, very sloppy, poor publishing. After the war, Winterbottom transferred his aviation knowledge into BOAC, the British Overseas Airways Corporation. Some of you may remember that. The long distance stuff running out of Britain was done by British Overseas Airways Corporation, and the European stuff was BEA, British European Airways. And then he did that for a few years and then went into farming. And of course, once the Ultra Secret came out, it paid him very handsomely indeed. There he is farming in the post-war period, sitting on a tractor. And there, just out of interest, is a copy of the book with his signature. I've sold about 40 copies of the Ultra Secret over the years, and if any of them have not had the paragraph, this updating, correcting paragraph about the Poles, I have photocopied one and put it into the right place. I've not glued it in, but I put it into the right place so that the error, Winterbottom's error over the Polish contribution would not be perpetrated. And of those 40 or so copies, I've only had 2 that have been signed. So it's quite nice that one occasionally comes across a signed copy of Winterbottom's The Ultra Secret. He wrote 4 books altogether. We've seen 2 of them. The one that came out before the war, sorry, not before, before the Ultra Secret, and then the Ultra Secret, which of course is the big seller. Then there was a Nazi collection describing his very interesting intelligence gathering work done. He calls himself there a top-level British agent in pre-war Germany. This is when he met all those senior Germans like Hitler and Hess and all the Luftwaffe people and so on. And then lastly, a much more considered autobiography, The Ultra Spy, which came out in 1989. Surprisingly, of those 4 books, they're all 4 quite meant to be non-fiction, of course, 4 non-fiction books. The last one has any illustrations in. It's rather surprising, I think, in a post-war period to produce books like this with no illustrations in whatsoever. He died himself in 1990, aged 92. So the Ultra Spy came out in 89. He died in 90, and he just married for the 4th time in 1986, aged 89. So, given the origins and the style of the ultra secret, there is no justification for regarding this book as any sort of official British history, and some people have made the mistake of thinking it had the stamp of approval from British officials and departments. It didn't. They just wanted to make sure that they weren't embarrassed by anything that was said. Its importance is that it was the first book in English, the first full-length book, to demonstrate that there was a large and successful code-breaking operation at Bletchley Park, and that the intelligence produced made a difference to the conduct of the war. And as Tiltman feared, and as he said in 1975, its publication did open the door, but thank goodness through that door, other, better, more balanced books have subsequently emerged. So thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you, Mark. That was great. I wonder if anybody has any questions. There have been a few comments passing by.
Or corrections. Jan Sliving is that says the extra paragraph at the end of chapter 2, US edition. The American publishers were skeptical and would have insisted on the paragraph for their edition. Now, how is it that the British master, the British generated master, which had obviously gone over, it wouldn't have been electronic, it would have probably been in some kind of a scannable form. How come that the Americans managed to get that in 1974? And if we had known about it, and after all, it was generated, the paragraph was generated in UK, why is it that Weidenfeld and Nicholson didn't put it in for some months afterwards into their own printings? So I don't think we can attribute it just to American skepticism. I don't think they would have said, we don't believe this, let's have an extra paragraph, and that Weidenfeld and Nicholson would have agreed to have that, or Harper and Row, let Harper and Row have it, without using it in the British edition, because they obviously thought it was an improvement, because they did put it in from 75 onwards. It's an easy fix, I agree with that.
Do you want me to just answer on that one, Mark?
Oh, yes, do.
Because I've just been unmuted. So I worked in British publishing in book production. And I do remember that day when it was released. I was on the tube and the newspapers hit. And I worked in educational publishing. And we were just about a year later, we were going to be doing a big, must have been a 30-year anniversary. I was probably 20 at the time, maybe slightly older. And there was this big hoo-ha in the publisher's office about what was going on. And like you said, some of the books were having to be rewritten, or that's how they felt. And Christy Campbell, who's known to Bletchley Park, he was the editor at the time. And I was sitting in the office thinking, oh, Bletchley Park, what's all this about Bletchley Park? My mother worked at Bletchley Park. I'd known that since I was a little girl. And so I put my hand up and said, my mother used to work at Bletchley Park. And they just looked at me in absolute shock, horror, as if to say, what on earth, and what did she do? That's what they wanted to know. What did she do? Right. And all I could say was, well, she was a filing clerk. And well, what else did she do? I said, I don't know. She doesn't say anything else. She was just a filing clerk. Anyway, so Christy said, well, watch out for that. Something is going to be happening in that soon. Well, at that time, my book production part, we sold foreign rights in everything, and America was a huge, big market. So there would have been some talk beforehand about where they could sell this book, and America probably would have said, oh yeah, we are interested, especially because of David Kahn's book earlier. And so that was what they would have agreed with the publisher, and they would have just sent proofs backwards and forwards, obviously no electronic. It would have been sent by courier across the ocean, and then somebody would have read it, probably David Kahn, and maybe some other people were putting their 2 pennyworth in. And as far as the government was concerned, they had already published the book, so it was just a fail-safe, I think, for America just to put that paragraph in to cover themselves, and then they sold a lot of copies, and that's how it used to be. The publisher just used to make money on it. It was the next edition.
Right, but if the Americans had, by some means or another, got this into their very first, and indeed all printings, it must have been originated in UK, because
Yeah,
it
well, the
obviously
printer would
required
have just
Winterbottom to
lifted the
write it.
plate. The printers
But
would have just lifted the plate and put a new plate in.
yes, oh yes, yes, yes. But why didn't Weidenfeld and Nicholson do it?
I don't know.
It must have been originated by Weidenfeld, Nicholson, and Winterbottom. So if it was a definite improvement, which it was a definite improvement to the American edition, why didn't Weidenfeld and Nicholson do it themselves? Why didn't they put it in their own books? I don't know. I can't answer that.
Maybe Winterbottom didn't feel quite the same way, that he needed to
Well,
have
he wrote that piece. Well, it's nominally written by him. I mean, it's written in the first person by him.
That's true. Yeah, I
And
don't know
it
the
appears
answer to that.
from 75 onwards, except for those two reprints in 99 and 2000. In 75 onwards, including the Futura paperback, you see, which is 1975.
Oh, that was my company, was Futura.
Right, well, it was in there.
It wasn't in the Futura edition?
It is.
Oh, it is, yeah, okay.
It isn't, yes. It's in the Futura edition, but it's not in the first, second, and third impressions of the hardback.
And what's the time range for that, for the first, second, and third?
The first, second, and third all come out in 1974, but the Americans are already selling thousands of copies of their books, the Harper and Row, with that extra paragraph in. So the paragraph must have been generated in the UK.
Okay. Well, my theory on that in that case would be that they ran on those sheets early on for possible new editions later on. They already had the sheets already printed, and they didn't need to put them in because they were being bound up at a later stage. That's all.
That does happen. Yes,
except
certainly.
It says an impression, so that doesn't sound quite right either, because an impression obviously is when they go back to press. So I really can't answer that why they didn't put it in. But
you have to remember, of course, that I'm sorry, not being insulting here, but publishers aren't bibliographers. I've seen many publishers confuse editions and impressions and all that kind of thing. They may well have wanted to boost the appearance of the book by putting these later. Well, they did actually have it printed in second impression and third impression and so on. So there must have been some tiny textual change to the plates they were printing from. But they, of course, they could have had the bulk of the sheets printed. I mean, that's often done, as you well know. It's once you've got the presses running, it's cheap to print lots and lots of extra sheets, and there is much less economy of scale in binding than in printing. So you bind up a limited number, and then if they sell, you bind up some more, and so on. They must have done a little bit more than that, because the third impression and the second impression of the UK edition do actually say printed in them second impression, third impression. So there must have been that much minor change. I mean, of course, that might only be one sheet, but they're not. It's not just that they've got a stack of sheets in the printer's warehouse and they just order up a new binding every so often. It's a little bit more than...
When you check the title page, just see if it's been tipped in, because sometimes they used to do
that.
No,
I don't. I know you can get tipped in title pages, etc. But they're not tipped in.
Okay. Interesting then. Thank you.
It is. I'm not laying down the law on this, because firstly, I haven't had total confirmation as to the exact publication dates. I'm pretty certain that I'm about right. 24th October 74 for UK, and about a week later for US. But there's this extraordinary fact that the US is a revised edition and better than the UK printings coming out for months afterwards. It's very strange.
Yeah, I reckon that was it. It was just they had the sheets and they just wanted them bound up.
You might be right. Yeah. Right. Where are we now? Thank you for that. Anyway,
Do have one specific question from
yes.
Martin Gillow.
Right.
Near the bottom of the list.
Right. I'm going down now. Where is it?
And I've invited Martin to.
Yeah.
I've unmuted Martin anyway, so he can read out his question.
Yeah. Thank you, Jerry.
Yes, please do.
For these special liaison units, you said they passed information with a one-time pad. I'm sure I've read that they used Typex to send. Is that correct, or is it just?
I don't think that. No, the British used Typex, yes, but I don't think the special liaison units were using Typex.
Okay.
I think that they were. I'm absolutely certain they used one-time pads, not Typex. I say the British did have Typex in Africa, Northern Africa. There were Typexes there, but they were not used to take this information from UK to effectively directly to Montgomery via the SLUs.
Okay.
I think the SLUs were doing effectively manual decryption using one-time pad.
Okay. That's a quote from Bletchley Park's site, which says the units retrieved ultra reports from MI6 via secure links, which used the British Typex or one-time ciphers. Interesting.
Well, I may be wrong. I mean, clearly I wasn't there at the time, but I don't. No. I would be very surprised if. I mean, I'm sure they used one-time pads, and I would be very surprised if they then used Typex to do some further encipherment. Perhaps they did. I don't know. I don't think so. And I wouldn't have thought that these SLUs had Typex machines with them. They're very small units. They're only typically four officers.
Okay.
And you need two people to carry a Typex machine after all.
All right. Thank you.
But I mean, if you find out any more, I mean, I did say when people got contributions or corrections, I'm always, keen to be updated where I've got things wrong.
All right. I'll find out.
Thank you.
So there's a question from Bob W. of Cambridge. Hi, Mark. Why do you think the UK authorities were happy for Winterbottom to publish? Actually, I suspect they weren't that happy, but still.
Well, they gave him permission. There's no question. He was not commissioned by anyone in authority officially, but he had to go through all those sieves. And as I say, the MI6 and GCHQ and the Foreign Office and so on, they were all allowed to take out things that they thought would be embarrassing. They might have been slightly grudging. They might possibly have hoped that he didn't publish, but they weren't going to stop him. Perhaps that was a realistic decision. If you recall what happened when Margaret Thatcher, some years later, tried to ban Spycatcher, not only did she fail to ban Spycatcher, but she gave it the biggest worldwide publicity you could possibly organize for a book of that sort. So maybe it was a sensible decision not to attempt to suppress the ultra secret, but to make sure it didn't have anything that was terribly embarrassing. And after all, he wasn't given any access to the documentation. So it's not long after that, I think it's 77, if I remember rightly, that they start to transfer into what was then the Public Record Office. They start to transfer some of the documentation which was being held at GCHQ. And they talk about the story being to the credit of the British, which deserves to be better told. That happens about that time in the 1970s. So maybe realizing that they couldn't keep the lid on it forever, it's better to have people having access to some of the original documentation and getting the story right. But they did not, as far as I know, there was no attempt to try to verify or check or endorse anything which Winterbottom said. And that's why, of course, it contains some major errors. Well, no, I'd say not, but that's why. If people in GCHQ had been allowed to comment on the content and the truthfulness of it, it may well have come out as a different sort of book. But they didn't. That wasn't the task be undertaken in the 1975, 1976. 72, 73, 74. They just took out the embarrassing bits. And Winterbottom agreed on that basis. And of course, he wanted to beat Cave Brown to publication. And if I remember rightly, Cave Brown's publishers were, of course, Harper and Row, who published the American edition of Ultra Secret.
So there's one last question, I think, from Michael. There are always things going on in the background. Could the talks at IBM leading to Lucifer and eventually to DES, could the state of those talks have anything to do with this leak, this writing of the book?
I don't know. I don't recognize that at all.
Okay, fair enough.
I think, as I say, the sequence of events, as far as I know it, is that Winterbottom knew about these things, but had hoped that people wouldn't publish. But when Cave Brown came along with Cave Brown was already lined up with Harper and Row, and obviously was hot on the trail. and was going to publish something, and of course he did. He published a shocking great book, as you know, Bodyguard of Lies. But Winterbottom thought if he, Winterbottom, was going to get any benefit from the opening up of this secret, then he, Winterbottom, was going to crack on and do it. And so between 72 and 74, he went ahead and did it. And I don't think, I may be totally wrong, maybe I'm being naive, I don't think it was stimulated by anything official going on at that stage. I think Winterbottom was the driving force, stimulated by this interview with Cave Brown.
And presumably there might have been some embarrassment that Władysław Kościuszko and, sorry, I've got a clock running in the background.
Oh, right, yeah.
And Gustave Bertrand had published first, and we felt that maybe we should catch up.
I honestly don't think so, because I feel if the British establishment had actually wanted at this stage to make a definitive statement about what the British had achieved, they would have produced a rather more authoritative book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I mean, there were obviously people ex-BP, there were people at GCHQ, you know, who would have been far better equipped to write a balanced book about what had been done. But there was no assistance given to, as far as I know, no assistance given to Winterbottom. And you look at the books, they're absolutely devoid of any single reference at all. There is no attempt, no bibliography, no reference at all. He claims to have had a good memory. If anyone's really interested in his career, there are 35 half-hour tapes in the Imperial War Museum oral history collection. And he sat down, did those somewhere near the end of his life, and he did speak quite freely and lucidly about various aspects of his life's experience and so on. So he put all that down there. I think he prided himself on having a good memory. It wasn't many people who pride themselves on having a good memory actually don't have quite such a good memory as they think they have, and I think that's probably the case with him, alas.
Okay, we're coming up to the end of this slot, but
right.
Does the speaker have an opinion on the Polish and French writings?
Oh, well, I haven't read the Polish. I haven't read the Polish writings in Polish, but there are quite a number of books, of course,
yes,
written by the Poles. And of course, we've got Zdzisław Kapera, who's the editor of the Enigma Bulletin and so on. So they have rightly, the Poles have rightly felt that many people, including Winterbottom, and possibly some people have felt Winterbottom, as it were, led the charge, who have belittled or ignored the Polish contribution. You might remember when the film U571 came out about 20 years ago, which apparently the story of the film, it was presented as fiction, of course, but the story of the film is that the US Navy, through daring do and ingenuity, capture an Enigma machine from a crippled U-boat, and this enables the ciphers to be broken. I mean, a simplistic view, of course, and incorrect, because that never happened. And there was a huge furore in the British press saying, oh, you know, we captured, the Navy captured one before America even came to the war, and it's the Royal Navy who deserve the credit, etc., etc., etc. And the producers of the film put a kind of an extra frame in at the end to point out that the Royal Navy had captured an Enigma machine in 1941, and that there was no attempt to belittle what they'd done, etc., etc. But if you look carefully at the literature at the time, the newspaper literature at the time, there's one or two Poles saying, hang on, Brits, there you are claiming that you did it all, not the Americans, but what about recognizing what we did? Because so often, it's not so common now, but so often in the late 20th century and into the beginning of this century, writers on Bletchley Park, Enigma, Ultra, etc., would rightly praise all the talented and clever people, the Turings and the Knoxes and the Denistons and so on, and not really say enough about the Poles. And the Poles have been very keen to remind the world that they did it first. And I mean, they deserve every credit for that, no question. So I think the Poles now have made that point, and I think any responsible writer on either side of the Atlantic writing about these matters will, of course, acknowledge the Poles. But there was a time where that was not the case, and Bletchley Park was a British triumph. I mean, of course, there are triumphal elements to Bletchley Park, but it was built on the work of the Poles.
And at that point, I think I'm going to draw this call to a close. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. I'd like to thank Mark for speaking. And I'd just like to give a brief mention into the next few talks which we have. July 23rd, we have some engineering days when 3 different machines that we have in the museum, the Elliott 903, the Turing Welshman bomb rebuild, and EDSAC, will be discussed in considerable details and a deep dive looks into them. On July 28th, Professor Chris Christensen of the Northern Kentucky University will be speaking to us for a change about the Imperial Japanese Navy's cipher systems. And on August 18th, we're going to visit the CERN's Large Hadron Collider and have a talk about that. So thank you for everybody. Thank you for speaking, Mark, and goodbye.